Hello and welcome to another tutorial. Today we're going to be creating the material for our crate that we finished in the previous video. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, make sure you check those out. They'll be in the Maya playlist. Now we're going to need two things before we jump into the video. Firstly, we're going to need a crate texture. Now today's focus is going to be, to begin with, manipulating something that already exists. We are going to have tutorials in the future where we look at creating hand-painted wood materials for this particular crate, but what we're looking for is going to Google, typing in crate texture and grabbing something that looks like this, and we're going to manipulate this to fit in our UV. What we want to try and avoid is something like this that's got a slat through it, or this one, or this one. Any of the others for the most part should be okay, but this is the one I'm going to be using, and I'll include a link to this in the description down below, so if you want to follow me and do exactly as I do, this is the one to pick. Now we're going to be spending most of this particular tutorial in Photoshop. You might find that we flick briefly backwards and forwards between Photoshop and Maya to kind of apply the material at the end. But I just want to make, just want to say really, if you've never used Photoshop before and you want to make sure that you can keep up, feel free to have a look at the really brief intro to Photoshop video that is in the Photoshop playlist. It will give you a pretty good idea of how Photoshop works and where everything is, and hopefully you'll be able to follow along in this video a little bit more freely. So the first step is to open up the crate material. Now I've saved this as bait crate material. It's kind of irrelevant what name you give it, just as long as you can find it. And we also want to save or open up the crate_UV texture file that we created. Now this is the render of the UV map from our crate model. And it's important that we open both of these two things. So I'm going to control click both of them, and then I'm going to click open. Now once I've done that, you notice I get two tabs here. Obviously the one on the right is my UV and the one on the left is my base crate material. Now the first step really is to take elements of this material and apply it to our crate UV. But before we do that, let's explain what the UV represents. Each one of these white lines represents an edge on the 3D model. Anything outside of the UV space, anything out here, is useless. Okay, we could put anything out here. We could put Dick out here. We could put memes. We could put Gordon Ramsay asking for lamb sauce. We could put all kinds of stuff out here, and nobody would see it. It would be a massive waste of space and memory, and it would make the file much larger. So with this in mind, we obviously want to keep the textures on, or maybe just a little bit outside of, these white shell borders. Now the ones I really want to focus on are the ones here. These represent our extrudes. If you remember, if we can quickly switch back to Maya. If you remember, we extruded into the shape, and this face and this face are represented by this face and this face, and you can kind of see how that might look. The edge comes all the way in from the outside and connects into the center here. So when we're butchering this material and making it fit, we do need to make sure that we're keeping things roughly where they should be. We don't want to kind of have the side panel here coming all the way over to this edge or into the center. Hopefully that makes sense, but if it doesn't, it will make sense in a second. So the first step is we're going to look at filling this top section. Okay. Now we're going to complete one section and then we'll duplicate it to the others. We're not going to worry about adding too much detail to this for the time being. So let's jump on over to our base crate material and let's have a look at what we've got. So the first big difference is that this wood here doesn't come off at an angle. Okay. It comes off straight. Now this isn't a problem. We can use this. This is absolutely fine. So the first step is to take our Marquee Tool, which is on the left here, and this is just a square selection tool. All we have to do is hold left click and just drag our mouse and we'll create one of these. And all I'm going to do is grab the right or left slat here, and I'm just going to press Ctrl C on my keyboard. That's going to copy that selection, and then I'm going to jump on over to crate_UV BMP and I'm going to paste this, and you'll see that it's much bigger than the UV map itself, so we're going to have to scale this down. Now to do this we have to use something called the transform tool. There are two ways of accessing this. The first one is within the move tool here, we have something called show transform controls. Now if I click on this, you notice I get a few dots, and I can use these to manipulate the image however I please. The other way of accessing this is by pressing Control and T on the keyboard, and this gives us the same kind of thing. Now what we want to do is we want to use these corner points and these lateral points, the vertical points, to basically fit this in place. So let's start. I'm going to roughly position it in place here. I'm going to make sure it fits from a width point of view. Don't worry if it kind of gets a little bit skewed, because we're going to change the height of it as well. So that will fix a lot of the distortion that you're seeing. And we want to make sure that it fits at the top and at the bottom. And you'll notice that I'm not going too far over that white line. I really want to just cover it. Certainly here, I'm going to zoom in really close. I don't want that to go too far over. And the same thing applies here. So I'm zooming in. I can see those squares when I zoom in this close, because that is what we call the pixel grid. So I really am seeing just pixels at that point. And once we're happy with any transform that we've done, we can press enter, and that will just finish that particular move. So now we're going to do the same on the other side. So I'm going to jump back over to base create material. I'm going to grab the one from the other side as accurately as I can, and I press Control C again, and I come over to create_UV, press Control V, and we're going to go through the same process. This process can take a little while depending on the complexity of the UV, but it can be quite therapeutic. Now when we were doing this one, we were making sure we didn't want to go over any of these white lines. We want to make sure that we're not taking up too much space from this polygon. We want to kind of keep them where they should be. So I'm just going to fit this in place. I want to make sure again that I'm just covering that. I don't want to come all the way over, because that's then going to cut off some of the space in here. And I'm just going to spend a few seconds just making sure that I've covered all of the relevant sections. I'm actually going to move this one a little bit further over so that it kind of is similar. So let's zoom out. I'm going to press enter, and that's that done. So we have two slats in place. Before we go any further, let's rename these layers. Now I'm going to rename them left slat and right slat. The one I did first was the right slat, so I'm going to call this right slat. And we can rename this layer just by double clicking on the text and just typing that in. Again, once we're done, we can just press enter, and that will sort that out. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to grab the central top section and the central bottom section. We can do this in exactly the same way that we've been working so far. So I can just use the Marquee tool to grab this selection. I can press Control C, come into my Create UV, and press Control V. Now you'll notice when I've done that it's kind of in an awkward position. It's beneath one of my slats but above the other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this by double clicking on layer 1. I'm going to call this top slat, and I just want to drag this beneath both the left and the right slat, and I can do that by holding left click and just dragging beneath them, and this just makes it a little bit easier for me to position it. Okay, so I'm going to position it roughly in place. Then I'm going to press Control and T, and I'm just going to scale this down into place like so. So I'm going to make sure there's a tiny bit of overlap. We don't want too much, but because it's underneath the layer, we don't need to worry too much about that. Now I've just noticed on my right slat that I've copied a little bit too much, and I've got some darkness here. All I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab my Marquee tool, and I'm just going to delete that particular selection of polygon pixels, and you can kind of see that where I've done that, I've left the white line. So all I need to do is press Control T and just scale this over the top again, and that's the end of that. So let's jump back over here, and we need to grab now the bottom slat, and we can do that again just by using the Marquee tool, selecting it, pressing Control C, jumping over, and pressing Control V. And we're going to go through exactly the same process. So I want to drag this right to the bottom. I'm going to call this bot slat for bottom slat, and I'm just going to scale this down into position so that it looks a little bit more awesome. Now you'll notice that each one of these slats is unique. A lot of you who have had experience in this before will be saying, well, I could probably just copy one, rotate it, position it in place, and copy the other. And yeah, you could absolutely do that. But the problem you then end up with is it all looks a little bit samey. And one of the parts of this tutorial that we're going to be looking at later on is adding some very simple hand-painted details to this to kind of individualize some of this detail. We're also going to be looking at clone stamp to get rid of some of these bolts and paint our own back on top. But for now, let's have a look at the inner section here. Now this is a little bit more complicated. We're going to go through the same process. We do not need to come into here anymore. We will come back here in a second, but for now we can focus on this. Now I'm going to focus on my right slat here, which is this one on the right. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use my Marquee Tool and I'm going to grab a section of this, like so. I'm going to press Ctrl C and Ctrl V. And I'm going to jump back to my Move tool. I'm just going to position this in the center here. I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call this Right Slat Skew. Now I'm calling it Right Slat Skew because that's exactly what we're going to do with it. So this is going to be the right slat that we're going to skew into position. But before we do this, we have to make it look like there is some kind of continuality from this edge down, because this would be the same piece of wood if we were actually making this crate for real. And the simplest way of doing this is again by pressing Ctrl T, but this time we right click and all I'm going to do is flip horizontal. Now this is, when we position it, going to make it look like all we've done is symmetried that particular piece of wood. But watch what happens when we start to transform this. Now I'm going to press Ctrl T again. Now this time I'm actually going to position it in place, and unlike last time we're going to have to do an additional operation. We are going to have to skew this. Now all skewing is taking one of these points and moving it independently of all of the others. Now we call it skewing because it kind of skews the perspective. It warps the image to kind of look like it's something that it's not. And we can control this skew by holding Control and moving over to one of these points. So you notice that as I do that with Control held, my black arrow turns into a white arrow. When I've got my white arrow, that's letting me know that skew is enabled. And if I left click now, I can move this independently of all of the other points. And what I want to do is I just want to position this somewhere here. All I'm looking at doing is following that edge there, like so. And then I'm going to come up to the top, I'm going to hold Control, and I'm going to do it again, making sure that I've got my white arrow selected rather than my black arrow. If you've got any pixels still showing here, well, we can just hold Control and we can move this up, and we can skew that top section as well. And again, once we're done, we can just press Enter, and that solves that. And if we zoom back, can you kind of see how it doesn't look symmetried anymore? It kind of looks like the geometry goes inwards, and this is what we're looking for. This is exactly what we're trying to do. So let's look at the left slat now. I'm going to do exactly the same process. I'm going to grab a selection of this wood, trying to go right up to the edge if we can. And what I'm doing is I'm actually using the gap here to kind of gauge my selection somewhat. We don't want it to look like it's massively different. We want it to look like it's the same. And I'm going to go through the same process. So I'm going to move it. I'm going to press Ctrl T. I'm going to flip horizontally. I'm then going to skew this in place. I'm going to position it. We don't have to position it and scale it first. We can just skew, but sometimes I find that the skewing is a little bit easier if you've already done some of the work with that lateral slider there. Just skew this into position. Doesn't matter if it's not perfectly straight, because we're going to dump something else on top of this later on, which will sort that out. And we can press Enter. Before we do anything else, we need to rename this layer. We need to make sure we click on the layer 1, and I'm going to call this Left Slat Skew. And then we need to do the same for the top and the bottom. I'm going to try and do this a little bit quicker. It's exactly the same process. Control C, Control V. I'm going to move it off. I press Control T, right click. This time I'm going to flip vertically as opposed to horizontally, because of course the orientation of this particular object has now changed. So we're going to position this in place. I'm going to press Control T, scale this back. And this time we're going to use the positioning of our previous slats to kind of gauge where we're going to put this. We want to get this relatively accurate, otherwise it's not going to look quite right. Making sure we've got that where it needs to be. And a good way of doing this is just checking the kind of the white line there. Is it straight? If it's straight, it means that both points are kind of equal. And if I zoom out, you can kind of begin to see the effect that this is having. Now, it doesn't matter if we have an edge here. Okay, if you can see that, that just actually will add to the texture later on when we do some hand painted details. For now, we can absolutely leave it as it is, and I'm just going to call this top slat skew. Now finally, let's have a look at the bottom slat. I'm going to go through exactly the same process. I'm going to grab my Marquee Tool. I'm going to make a selection. We don't want to make a selection that's too big, otherwise we spend our life skewing. This is exactly the same as the top slat. I'm going to right click, flip vertically instead of horizontally, position it in place, and then I'm going to skew this exactly the same way as I've done all the others, making sure I've got my white arrow, not my black arrow. And there we have it. So that's it. I can see actually that I've got a very slight darkness over here, so I'm just going to come to my left slat skew. Oh, there it is. I rename the layers but then forget that they're actually renamed, so I'm just going to position this over position it if I need to, do the same at the top here. There we go, so now that's gone, you can see exactly what we're trying to create here. Okay, so let's jump now back on over to the base crate material. Now what I'm going to do this time around is I'm actually going to select the central wood panels, and I want to try where possible to avoid this dark shadow that we've got. Okay, it's okay if you get some of this corner here, that's not too much of a problem. So I'm going to select roughly in the center, and I'm going to press Ctrl C. I'm going to jump on back over to my crate UV, and I'm going to press Ctrl V. So I've Ctrl C'd in the other layer, Ctrl V in this one, and I'm going to drag this to the bottom of my layers, because of course it is at the bottom of all of those, and I'm going to just scale this into position. Now we don't want to skew this if we can help it. We do want to try and keep this somewhat the right size. It's up to you whether or not you include that little dark section there. You can, if you like, just overscale this just a smidge, just to kind of hide that, and that will be fine. But as I say, you can, if you want to, make sure that that's in there. We can really make the whole thing fit if we want to. And then we can kind of see what's going on. Now I'm going to rename this. This is called Central Slats. My layer 1, which was my bot slat skew, I'm going to call bot slat skew. Okay. So we've got all of these in position. Let's have a look now at the slat itself. So this is the modelled slat that we produced. This is in the center of our model, and if you remember, we overlapped all of these central sections on top of each other, so one UV is going to cover all of them. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing to this as we've done with this. I'm going to come over to my base crate material, but this time, instead of grabbing something from the outside, I want to grab something from the center. So I'm going to grab this. In fact, actually I'm not going to grab that one because it's got the darkness here. What I want to do is perhaps grab this one here, not the whole thing, maybe just a portion of it. I'm going to press Ctrl C, come over and press Ctrl V, and I'm going to rename this. So I'm going to call this, oh crikey, I'm going to call this Wood Slat Center, and I'm just going to scale this into position. I'm going to press Ctrl T. Now, unlike previously, we're not going to scale. This time we're going to rotate first. If I move my mouse outside of this transform, you can kind of see how my kind of arrows change from kind of a scale selection to a rotation selection. So I'm going to begin to rotate. Now you might notice that this rotate is not particularly snappy. It's kind of fluid. Trying to get 90 degrees can be quite tough. To fix this, all we have to do is press Shift, and you can see that we get 15-degree snaps. So once we're at 90 degrees, I can position this in place, and I'm just going to scale this now so it fits the central section of that UV. Very important that we do this, because if we just skew it over the whole thing or scale it over the whole thing, it's not going to work particularly well. Now we're going to duplicate this, and I'm going to duplicate this by using a hotkey rather than right clicking over here and duplicating the layer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Alt down on my keyboard, and I'm actually going to left click, and I'm going to drag that up, and that's going to create another copy for me. And we're going to go through the same process we went over here. So I'm going to press Control T, I'm going to right click, I want to flip vertically, and I'm just going to scale this down so that it fits there. Okay. I'm then going to select my wood slat center again, and I'm going to go through the same process. I'm going to hold Alt, I'm going to drag this off, I'm going to press Control T, I'm going to flip it vertically, and then I'm going to scale this into place. Making sure that everything fits where it should. So you kind of see that as I was positioning it, I had some white just showing through. It really is important as we do this that we check all of the time to make sure that none of the white is showing through, certainly where some of these corners are. It's not too much a problem if it's a very slight issue, but we want to make sure that they're covered. So that's going to be it for this video. In the next video, we're going to be grabbing a tablet, and we're going to be adding some funky shadows to this to really bring out the depth of this material. We're also then going to be duplicating this around and looking at adding some really cool damage to this using hand painted techniques, and we're also going to clone stamp out some of these bolts to make this look a little bit cleaner. I hope this video has been fun. I hope you've learned something. I look forward to showing you some cool stuff next time.